there as well. I'm really trying to picture how we'll go back to in-person meetings after this. It's kind of cool to have two discussions going at once that are related. So if you haven't taken a break up to this point, we've decided to push through since we only go for another hour formally, and then we'll have leave the line open for a social time. So please do take a break if you need it, except for Michelle and Eric and Everett. I mean, obviously if you need it, but we're going to jump into the 3 o'clock session. How does a tribe or a nation create a THPO? And with this, we're going to do a run through of the steps in the application and the stuff needed. So Julie likes to keep me focused on next steps, and looking towards the end of this workshop, we want to make sure that you leave knowing what you would need to come back with if you decide to join us for the May and the June workshops, to actually have a one-on-one virtual walkthrough of the application in the interest of getting it completed. And right now we're going to do, stop the share of this, an overview. And I had emailed those documents to you. So I'm going to pull up the application itself while we talk, and I'm going to turn it over to Michelle and Eric jointly to do a brief presentation, and then also save some time for discussion in the next half hour or so of an overview of the application. And then at 3:30 Eastern, we will jump into those THPO functions and responsibilities that we've been touching on throughout. And that is also a document that I sent to you.
You go for it, Eric, because you're good at this part.
Sorry, getting a whole bunch of emails coming at me at the same time and messages.
Okay.
You know, the vast majority of this stuff is super, super simple. And unfortunately, the National Park Service, like most government agencies, loves to bury everything under bureaucracy and language. So I think the biggest parts when we're thinking about the application is just keeping it in real plain English. And, you know, when I was the THPO for my community, I always felt like I was more of a cross-cultural communicator and like an interpreter than I actually was anything else. And all I did was try to help like tribal folks understand what the agency folks wanted, and then try to relay the informations back and forth in a way that made sense. So often you're going to feel like you're kind of stuck in the middle and you're not sure, and you're trying to help everybody, and it's okay. When you're getting into this and you're looking at these program plans, right? Some of this is super simple. A description of your tribal lands. That's a map, including maybe a title status report on the trust lands held by the tribe, you know, from the BIA. And you can attach that in and give a total acreage amount and show how much is in allotted land versus trust held by the tribe. That is important because there are situations where if a federal agency is having a proposed undertaking on an individual's allotment, they can request the THPO to intervene in addition to the THPO if they have a problem with the THPO. And so that's a real important part for tribes to remember, is that individual tribal members on their individual allotments can sometimes have another voice get added to the pool. Tribes that don't have individual allotments don't have those issues. So program plan, right? Description of your tribal lands, keep it simple. What's in trust? Don't worry about fee lands. Don't worry about your ancestral territories, because that's where you're going to be exercising your sovereignty, not where you're assuming the responsibilities as a THPO, right? When you're talking to NPS, keep it just for what NPS needs to know. Access to qualified professionals. Often, I think tribes, when they're thinking about this, think that they need to hire an archaeologist. You do not need to hire an archaeologist. You can have one on contract. You can have one on a list of contractors that you can call if you need them. You can use the list that the state develops, usually at the State Historic Preservation Office, and use that as your jumping point and say, if we need professional services, we will use the state list because they are already professional and have been guaranteed through the state. There's ways you can get around without having to hire one. Now, having said that, if your tribe has the resources and the capability, consider it. If you have a tribal member with a degree in cultural resource management, museum, history, Native American studies, something that's related to this, consider trying to get them to come home and help this program, and getting some people to come in, even if you're just contracting them to short term to help get your staff up on the ground, right? There's nothing wrong with that. Description of how the tribe is established an advisory review board. Again, this is a really simple thing. Do you have a culture committee? Do you have a NAGPRA committee? Is the council going to be the responsible party overseeing the THPO? I don't really recommend that. THPOs are political appointees already, and there's going to be conflicts if the tribe has capital development projects and they want to do that, and the THPO has a preservation point that they need to stick to that is in conflict with the tribal council. So usually having good policies and procedures and a separate committee will make sure that that conflict doesn't arise. But often tribes have these. Everett, go ahead.
I just want to throw in my recommendation would be that a THPO should have an advisory board that's a historic preservation advisory board, because all too often tribes will either use their tribal leadership and or a cultural committee. And the problem is then you have a committee that's been tasked with doing things such as preserving your culture. And usually it's a group of elders and they're trying to do things like beating class, genealogy, tribal oral history. And then the THPO comes in and they're wanting to talk archaeology, and it doesn't always work. And then your THPO has to be a member of that board. And so you might have these elders that are trying to preserve culture, and then you have someone coming in that's trying to talk about archaeology, and it doesn't always sync up. My recommendation, just a neutral tribe can do however they so see fit. You know, you can use your tribal government, you can use a cultural committee, you can do what. Your tribe may not be that large, but if your tribe has the capacity to create a program, a board specifically for the THPO, that is the best practice in my mind. I just wanted to mention that.
And then also too, because I just want to say that Eric is going to go, we're going to go through this pretty fast. It's okay. If you're getting lost, you're like, what is that? Because we're going to go through it in depth tomorrow with you guys. We just want to give you guys kind of a look-see, you call it. And also I do want to say about the advisory review board I know Everett said that maybe not if maybe his tribe doesn't do a cultural committee, but an advisory board. And if you don't have that right now for you tribes out there, that's okay, because you can write in your application that you will establish one and you will go by these guidelines. So don't freak out if you don't have an advisory board right now, but we'll talk about that more tomorrow.
Yeah, most councils and tribes already have an existing policy or ordinance on how the development of new committees will be done. So if you don't have one that is going to meet the need and the council agrees, you could just cite that we're going to follow tribal resolution, X, Y, and Z in order to implement and develop an advisory board once NPS agrees to the compact. Participation of tribal cultural authorities, other interested tribes, and the interested public. This is always the more interesting one. And the reason is that every tribal member is a cultural expert. And unfortunately, that means that THPOs often have a variety of voices of competing interests, some of them contradicting each other. Some tribes have very clear rules on who is the cultural leaders inside of communities. Some of us have much more diffused representation on those. And it is incumbent on the THPO to know not just who they need to talk to, but have the backing of their council and the advisory review board to be able to access those folks without being overwhelmed by them. And at the same time, not allowing in voices which may not necessarily be appropriate to take voice for the entire tribe and jump out front. Remember, the tribe is giving input to the THPO, who's going to give a concurrence on a federal action on the reservation. If they're accessing information that's going off the reservation, that's outside of what the THPO's function is with the NPS agreement, and that's a different animal. And so I'm just talking about like on reservation. You need to keep in mind that that's what they're there for. The agency comes in and says, like BIA archaeologist, individual tribal member applies for a mortgage loan. They want to develop and build a home there. I go to the THPO and tell them, hey, I have an individual tribal member. They want to develop a home. It's on this allotment. This is the floor plan that they gave me, and this is where they're going to develop their utility access lines. The THPO reviews their database and says, nope, good to go, clear it out, move it. But at the same time, if I don't have a good developed relationship with the THPO, I may not know who I need to talk to, may not know the right questions to ask, or I may, if I'm a bad BIA archaeologist, approve the project and not even talk to the THPO. That does happen. Mm-hmm. Let's see, what are the next ones? Oh, you jumped right down to the next part, didn't you?
I'm just skipping back and forth between the actual application cover sheet so that you can see that the checklist that we've sent you corresponds and has a little bit more information, including some links.
Yeah. And the acknowledgement of regarding non-tribal ownership and SHPO participation, really that is just a notification that the tribe is assuming a THPO on the reservation. And you just put that in the notice paper. And that way, if tribal members have an expressed concern about it, they can bring it up, and the tribal council and the appropriate folks that are developing the THPO can hopefully address that before it becomes a major issue in a community. Usually
This is the time also regarding non-tribal ownership. There's a lot of tribes throughout the United States that have non-tribal folks on their lands. Well, not on their lands, but inside the reservation boundaries, but isn't tribal lands, that type of thing as well. I do want to say though, can we, I'm sorry, I'm going to probably confuse everybody because we're going to talk about it more tomorrow, but can you go back to the top? I think we were talking about, the program, the application one, Roman numeral 1, the application cover sheet, and that's really simple. And then number 2, there's two things that you are going to get that is going to be required from your tribe, and we'll talk about that more, but you have to have 2 resolutions that are going to be in part of your application package. And one of it is the tribe saying that they are going to take over, they're becoming a THPO, and they're going to take over SHPO's responsibilities on tribal lands. And don't worry, we'll share resolutions with you, samples. And then the second one, the formal, somebody has to be designated in your, that's the second resolution, is the tribe is going to formally designate and name a person. And just because it's on the first resolution, THPOs change, it's all the time, or they could change. And the THPO designated person, it could be a tribal member, it could be, I know some tribes, their THPOs are an archaeologist. It just depends, or a cultural bearer, or somebody who's doing cultural resource management. I just kind of wanted to mention that because that's something to start thinking about, and that's what those 2 mean. So sorry for going backwards.
No, I think that's perfect, Michonne. They're critical pieces, right? And some tribes I've seen, I think my tribe actually did our resolutions as 1.
Yes.
So some put them in as 1 resolution, but it has to contain both components. So if you don't have both elements, whether it's 1 or 2 resolutions, then it'll be an incomplete package and get returned. And so it is really, really important.
You're capable of doing it as 1. We did ours as 1, and then the first THPO was an acting THPO of our tribal, our what we call like a chief or whatever some tribes call, we call him a chairman, but our chairman was the acting THPO in the beginning, and it was 1 resolution. And then they hire / appoint someone new. I'm the 3rd person, I believe, and counting the acting former chairman. And but those subsequent appointments or hirings can just be done in the form of a hiring, and then a letter sent on letterhead signed by the tribal leader to MPS. They don't necessarily require another resolution. The first resolution can be written in such a way where you're just establishing that you're going to designate somebody and it's going to be so-and-so. And then you can inform them in writing beyond that. Because MPS isn't going to come and police you to make sure that you've actually done a full resolution process. They just need to be informed in writing on letterhead by the tribal leader that this is what's been done and this is the person who you need to speak to.
Which also means if you have a turnover in staff, it is incumbent on the tribe to notify MPS of the changes.
They must do it. Yeah.
Yeah. If you don't, every federal agency that is currently interacting with your community will lose all of the access point of communication with your tribe. And that can have catastrophic problems. So super important.
Okay. Have we gotten all the way through?
I think we got through most of the big piece of it. I mean, the acknowledgement part is really just an outreach and a notification. In the case of my tribe, because we were terminated in the 1950s and then restored in the 1980s, we had only the tribal lands that were restored back to the tribe. So we only had trust lands that were divested interests in other parties. And so that made it much easier for my community to address that issue in our THPO application. If you have a very complicated reservation where there's a heavy level of checkerboarding, you may need to have some better descriptions and maps in this. And you may even need to do some additional outreach, but you're going to need to work with your council and the governing bodies of the community to figure out how that's done and what is going to be an appropriate level of outreach. And still remembering that even if you're taking on these responsibilities, it's only going to be on the trust lands. So if there's a fee type status held person, they're going to be working with the SHPO, not with the THPO. So again, like Everett's talked about earlier, those relationships with the SHPOs become really important, because if you have a site that crosses jurisdictional boundaries, both of you are now responsible for trying to get the concurrences on the finding of effect for that site.
Make it clear and easy too on the map where it says the total acreage, because the map is essentially justification. It's through citation where you're showing this is how many acres we have. But MPS, at the end of the day, your funding and all they really care about is what's the total number. And the map is what they use for justification and background information. So you want to make sure that it's very clear that this is the total amount that you have in trust, because if that's not represented very well and they think you have less than you actually do, your funding will be decreased. You know, your funding is based entirely on how much acreage is in trust.
Absolutely. And so those are some of the big parts with the program plan component. The next part of your application is really going to be talking about the list of the THPO functions that you're going to be assuming from the SHPO. And this is where the language in the application process starts to become, in my opinion, pretty burdensome, because it's not exactly clear what it's always requesting.
Okay,
when it says,
hey, Eric,
go ahead, Val.
I'm gonna pause you there for a moment. We've got 3:30 budgeted for the functions discussion. And I know we're still doing a flyover here, but I'm just going to ask if anyone has any questions or comments or needs clarification on anything up to this point. That's the cover sheet, the resolution, and the program plan, including the administrative elements. So what I'm toggling between is the checklist that Jamie Lee had created that I edited to make the numbers more closely correspond to the cover sheet. And this is the actual cover sheet from the application, which is also available on the Park Service website. So we've gotten up through number 5 at this point. I guess the question I have, so in talking to Jamie Lee about putting this together and the timeline of this whole process, and on the checklist, you can also see here, before she and Michonne did that fabulous workshop last March, Jamie Lee had also been creating some self-guided materials to help people on their own go through this process. So definitely go and find those on the Park Service THPO program page as well, and review them. If you need more information than we've been providing you here, there's a YouTube video of her giving a PowerPoint presentation that includes some more information on the timeline and writing the application section by section. One of the requirements is for your state SHPO, as well as ACHP, the Advisory Council, to chime in, and neighboring tribes, I believe, and contribute to the review of your completed application. Presumably that includes the elements that we've covered up to this point.
It will often go to the regional anthropologist, tribal liaison at the National Park Service too, who will also review it and may additionally call the tribe, or if there are archaeologists listed on it. When I was the Pacific West Region tribal liaison and cultural anthropologist, when Jamie would get the applications in for the West Coast, they would come to me, and then I would call around sometimes and talk to the archaeologists and make sure to check their CVs.
Checking the chat box here. Should these tribal actions be incorporated into and acknowledged in the THPO plan? Do tribal council resolutions adopting UNESCO, UNDRIP, statements of Aboriginal territories, inherent rights, and other supportive laws help strengthen sovereign goals? That is a good question, David, that I don't know the answer to. Maybe if one of our other THPOs knows the answer to David Whedon's question there, you can put that in the chat box for us. Pat Baird says, I don't think that's true. The funding formula is based on acreage of the reservation, any lands and trust outside those boundaries. I know that land area is part of the formula. As I understand it, there's a baseline number and then additional consideration and calculations are made for land area, but the difference that Pat and Everett are talking about, I confess that that's done on the Park Service end.
Hey, so I kind of have a question for who may know this. You know, there's some tribes, there may be a few tribes out there, they're federally recognized, and they may only have like less than an acre. Can they still apply?
There's any land in trust they can apply. If they do not have land in trust, they don't meet the qualifications.
Okay, so they just, okay.
Yeah, there are tribes that literally only have like an acre of trust land, and they can have a THPO.
Okay, good.
I'm not sure, I'm not quite comprehending the lands outside of those boundaries in trust. Perhaps that's something we don't have. If you can get land outside of your reservation boundary in trust, it's still trust land. And so land in trust, you have section 101 D2 authority. In other words, you as the THPO have the ability to be the primary voice to consult with on that land if it's in trust. And I don't think it really matters if it's within a certain, like, because your reservation boundary is probably an arbitrary boundary from whenever your tribe was established as being in this reservation, perhaps by a certain treaty or an act of Congress. And I don't think that's really relevant to the funding apportionment. I think that's simply based on how much is in trust, regardless of what the boundary the government may have drawn at some point for your tribe is.
The real only time it's going to get tricky is if your tribe has public domain allotments that are outside of the reservation boundaries, because in some of those cases, they are not actually considered part of the reservation, even though they're trust, and they may have differing jurisdictions. And those parcels get really wonky quickly. And if you have those and they're attached to your reservation, go talk to your realty department at BIA, or if you're self-compacted, go talk to them and then have a conversation with your THPO, because those ones get squirrely really quick and you never know who's going to have authority and jurisdiction over them. It's really a nightmare on those.
Every state gets wild. If it's a PL 280 state, or if it's public, you know, there's different classes of land, how your tribe may or may not have allotted, you know, all that gets really crazy. But you're supposed to, if the tribe is if it's restricted land, you should be getting funded to review projects that may impact that land, presuming the tribe is the primary interest holder of that land. I wasn't even aware that that was an issue.
Some more questions about land status here.
I think some of those were just our conversation about how do you report new lands. And I believe that you can report to the NPS at any point in time. I believe that you can send them an email and just say such and such, but typically a tribe, you know, your realty department may or may not be doing, more than likely if you have a realty department, if you compacted a tribal realty department, you're probably doing applications all the time to try and put land in the trust. And of course the BIA is probably not responding in a timely fashion. And so you may not have an update. You may not have any increased trust land for a year or two, and then all of a sudden you may get XYZ parcels approved and your land may have, you know, 4 or 5 jumps in 1 year. And do you really want to email NPS and have them refactor it every single time you have a parcel approved? No, probably not, unless you're just really on the ball and you have a lot of time on your hands. But most THPOs don't. And so usually what you do is you just tell them at the end of the year when you're doing your grant application, there's a box where they talk about acreage, or at least there used to be. I can't remember if there is now, but you can just tell them our acreage has increased by X amount, and then the following year they'll account for that amount of increase.
So I don't know if we talked about the, sorry, Eric, I don't know if we talked a little bit about that tribal lands description, but the BIA letter documentation. I'm just wondering, is Gary Kentley online? Gary, wake up. I saw his name, I think. And if Gary could maybe explain that, because the tribe has to do the total acreage of tribal lands. But then BIA has to acknowledge that because we can't just say, yeah, we've got millions, 20 million, billion acres. The BIA is going to have to acknowledge how much lands we have. So
correct.
Gary,
And usually tribes have or can get a title status report or a land status report from the BI Realty programs that will show that whole acreage amount in trust. And so that can be written into it. In the case of some tribes, like we noted it in ours, but we didn't include anything from the BIA, and the NPS accepted it. So a lot of times what ends up happening is NPS gets the acreage count and they just make a call, or that's when they're doing their outreach and their follow-up is to guarantee and verify. So if the tribe does that in the upfront, that's going to make the review way faster on the back end for NPS, because they're not going to have to do all that due diligence to call BIA and double check the numbers. So it is good if you can get that kind of information included in it. Really, the biggest part though is the acreage and the map. And is it possible where I can share my screen, Val?
Yeah, I'll stop sharing mine. You're a co-host, you should be able to.
Okay, let's see here. Let's turn on THPO application for my community. In the case of our land description of tribal lands, it's literally right there. Due determination, Grand Ronde no longer has exterior reservation boundaries. However, what we're requiring gives a status amount of how much we had at that time at the application, how many we were putting into trust. And then in my attachments, we had maps. Oh, is somebody not seeing my screen?
Yeah, we can't see your screen. There you go.
Is that working now?
There we go.
There it goes.
There you go.
Operator failure. I apologize, everyone. I like to think I'm tech savvy, but I am not. So a copy of this application is going to go out today to everyone. So you will be able to use this as boilerplate to develop the appropriate language for your own community. And I believe, Val, correct me if I'm wrong, Gary's sharing one that he developed?
It's Pasqua Yaqui that the Park Service, I believe, shares as well.
Excellent. So the big part is that it's important to have a good description of this and to keep it as much as for the application as it is for the THPO to know where their jurisdictional authority is and isn't. If you have parcels of property that are going to stretch across boundaries, that can be really complicated. And then, talking about interests of multiple parties, Grand Ronde ceded lands encompass most of Western Oregon, yet our reservation is this tiny little orange blob, like right there. And so our area of interest is significantly different than right? There's the actual reservation, and you can see a fee and trust status breakdown, as well as the original reservation boundaries. So it doesn't have to have a painful level of detail, but you should have enough detail in it where a layperson can identify what reservation, in what state, how many acres, and can I clearly identify potentially which counties and area it's in? Because if it's not readable, it's not going to make it easy for the reviewers.
So I see the next question. I see appears to be the next question. Does a THPO automatically assume responsibility for these new lands? I think the answer to that is yes. So the reason that you don't have jurisdiction whenever somebody else is a landowner is because the government is always very careful, as we all know, to prevent Native American tribes from having legal jurisdiction over non-Indians. That was the whole reason they had to pass the Violence Against Women Act. And so the way that this is set up, it allows people who are private individuals to involve the state or the federal government because maybe they don't like the tribe, or maybe they're not a tribal member at all. There are tribes that have people that have interest in their land who are not Native whatsoever. And so those people are then able, if someone has ownership in land and a federal project's going through it, they don't necessarily have to rely on the tribe. They can turn around and go to the state historic preservation office. But if a land is not in a restricted status and then becomes restricted, it no longer has private interest, theoretically, depending on the class of land. But at that point, if it's no longer, private land, if it's the tribe's land, then you have jurisdiction over it. Does anyone else want to chime in on that? But that's my understanding of it.
That's kind of what I've understood as well. I mean, update your annual report and then they'll correct as necessary.
Can you modify your approved plan after? I believe you can, but I've never gone through that process. Has any of the panelists done that?
So I don't know that there's any tribes that have a full preservation plan that's been submitted to NPS. If they do, wow, congratulations. Every tribe that I've ever talked to has said that they don't want to develop a preservation plan until after they have a more complete inventory. And with the limited amounts of funding and staff that we all have, that often results in, we will develop the plan later. And it goes into the annual report year after year after year after year, because you're still working on inventory and compliance requirements. So some of these things are like goals that end up coming up that you may realistically know that, look, this is a 10, 20, 25-year plan. Like, we're not going to be starting to think about this in the first 5 years at all. And you need to prioritize how you want to look at those and where your community is going to play its interests in those.
Our tribe literally writes, I have it pulled up. We're getting ready to do our application for annual funding, and it's THPO function 101B-C3, historic preservation planning. And literally what we write pretty much every year, I mean, I might reword it slightly, but it says the THPO office continues to work with our business committee, tribal elders, and cultural committee as able to identify historic and culturally significant sites that need to be inventoried and surveyed. When all sites have been incorporated into our database, the THPO will then coordinate to develop a comprehensive historic preservation plan. And we just report that the same, and that's a standard language. Most tribes use that. But I think that he was actually referring to the, it may have been David Whedon. Were you referring to the actual plan for the application or the total historic preservation plan?
Just in a general sense, it kind of related to the previous question that if including resolutions that acknowledge like UNDRIP and UNESCO and things of that nature support your sovereignty or can be beneficial in some way, can you modify the plan afterward to include those types of things? Adoption, tribal resolution, adopting those types of things.
So I think the big thing to think about is that the THPO application is not a plan. It's an application that shows what you currently have and what you're kind of proposing to do. So if you want to, as you're going on, incorporate additional, whether it's international or national law that helps reinforce tribal law, do it by all means. But you don't necessarily need to update that with NPS, because that's outside of the scope of what they even care about. They want to know, do you want a THPO? And if you can, do you want to agree to tell us the minimum of your plan and report every year? Okay, here's your money. I mean, it really is a hands-off approach once you get the application through and it's accepted. It's almost scary how much so it is.
They are not in the business of wanting to try and impact your sovereignty. They just want to give you money to perform a specific function, and they want you to report every year that you did that function and then apply for continued funding. And they don't like to get in the middle of anything else beyond that.
Thank you for that.
Okay, Val, we're at the favorite part of getting into the THPO functions. Now we can look at maybe
There's one more
go into the
I don't mean to cut you off, Michonne, but I do see
Oh,
one
go
more
ahead.
question before we go on to the, it's the, what if none of your lands are in trust and can you still qualify? We talked about that before someone asked the question, and I just wanted to, before we moved on to the functions, I just wanted to say, it's my understanding if a tribe has 0 restricted land, then they are not capable of applying to become to have a THPO program recognized by NPS. However, they could continue. There are tribes that are in that situation that have appointed someone and they call them a THPO, and they're not actually an officially recognized THPO. They don't have Section 101 D2 authority because there's no trust land, but they can still consult on projects that are located off of trust land, and they can function similarly to a THPO, and they can even choose to call them a THPO if they want. They just would lack the NPS designation, and they would lack any land over which they had full Section 101 D2 authority. But there are tribes that are in that circumstance. Anyway, I'll shut up after that and we can go on to the functions. I just wanted to be clear for that question.
Okay, no, there's been a lot of questions about land status that I really should know the answers to, but it's kind of one of those things at this point that I have it in my head that I don't understand all the 50 shades of land status, and so I just move on with my life. So the SHPO functions, I also sent you that as a handout, and they come directly from the regs regarding NHPA. So what you have in the handout that I emailed is copied and pasted. So here are the SHPO responsibilities that may be assumed by tribes, and then toggling back to the checklist.
And this
Yeah,
is where we're just going to copy and paste right from the SHPO's duties out of the National Historic Preservation Office, and you're going to paste it right into your application. You're going to change some things around, and some of the duties you're not going to take on, or unless you want to take them on. So for the SHPO one, the responsibility of a state historic preservation officer, number A, in cooperation with federal and state agencies, local governments, and private organizations and individuals, direct and conduct a comprehensive statewide survey of historic properties and maintain inventories of such properties. So of course, we're going to change it to, and private organizations and individuals direct and conduct a comprehensive tribal lands survey of historic properties, because we are assuming SHPO's responsibilities. The THPOs are taking over those SHPO responsibilities on our tribal trust land. So we're just going to copy that and change the words around. And we'll work with that tomorrow to talk about that. And what A is, so what that means is and you're going to conduct a comprehensive statewide survey, a comprehensive tribal land survey. Is so pretty much, so for the Reno Sparks Indian Colony, we had over 2,000 acres when we applied back. And since then, we've received additional 13,000 acres. So that kind of answers that. We did receive, and we told the Park Service, okay, through Congress, through the act of Congress, we received additional lands. And so we get a little bit more money from THPO. So always tell them about your lands. The other thing is there's just no way I can do for 15,000 acres. I can't do a whole big survey all at once for those 15,000 acres. So what you're going to do is, so for tribal lands, every time we have our HUD program, we're going to build new houses. So of course they had to do Section 106. I went through that with our housing program, and now they're getting ready to, and housing hired an archaeological firm, a cultural resource firm. They came in and they did a survey of 12 acres because it was just a few houses. So that's how you're starting to maintain your historic properties and inventories of this area. Now there's other places that you'll be doing of surveys, and maybe your tribe can't afford to do surveys, but that's where this Secretary of Interiors comes in, and what you will learn tomorrow more in the application. So that's how you start to build your inventory, and you maintain that inventory. And some tribes, they have some great data that's put into a very good program for your computer. And I have that listed in a program for us. But I also, how you're going to maintain those inventories is your file cabinets. If you manage a cultural resource program, you're already maintaining those files. You just have to keep them confidential, maintain and do a big computer program to maintain those. But right now, and then every year, the National Park Service will ask you, how many inventories or how many acres did you inventory this year? And if you did 0, then you did 0. There's several times I put 0 there. And then there's several times I'll put 2, 4, because that just depends on what has happened on our tribal lands that year. So that's kind of what that means. I probably went a little bit too far, but that's what A is. A and
I think I would say, on top of what Michonne said, take a look at the examples that'll be provided later today. You know, they have really good descriptions, and in the case of some of them, they may be pulled directly from the State Historic Preservation Office's website, like Michonne said. And in those cases, it's easy to maintain standards if you're adopting what the state already has and just bringing it across. But by all means, exercise your tribal sovereignty and increase those requirements if you need to. Or if you feel that they're a little too strict because the state is exerting interest in things that maybe are beyond what you feel is their scope, you can go the other direction. But that's the opportunity for you to set kind of those standards and what you're going to do on those. And some of them could be super detailed and some of them not. You know, you could talk about using an ArcGIS database to maintain geospatial data and hanging all of your files on it and everything. Or you can say, we will maintain hard copy files and use a highlighter and write notes in the margin. Like it doesn't have to be rocket science. It has to fit the needs of your community. So know what your capacity is, know the level of investment that you're going to make, and know that it's going to change year to year, because sometimes you're going to be able to go further than others. Some years it's going to be a struggle to maintain. Again, part C, preparing and implementing a comprehensive plan. As Everett noted earlier, I mean, some of these are things that are noted in there and are never going to get done, or are never ending cycles of going to work on it. And if you do develop a plan, there's nothing stating that you can't update it, especially if new information becomes available. States update their preservation plans like every 10 to 15 years. So it is not uncommon if you do decide to develop one, that if you're going to want to update it. So don't, if you decide to develop one, don't think that you're stuck with it. You can always go back and amend it. Just make sure you note to the NPS during your reporting that you did.
And then again, you're going to put, instead of, well, you can leave it statewide, prepare and implement a comprehensive tribal lands historic preservation plan when you paste it into your application.
Absolutely. And yes, Pat, no state has a complete inventory as well, although I know you're hell-bent on getting Nez Perce there. So, sorry, Pat likes to give me a hard time, so I have to note him a little bit. The next parts, you know, are the ones where tribes start to kind of winnow out some of these. Administering the state program of federal assistance for historic preservation within the state, or in this case on the tribe. Most tribes take that. Advise and assist as appropriate federal, state agencies and local governments in carrying out their historic preservation responsibilities. This is a normal part of what you're going to do anyways, because this is consultation. Everett.
You moved past D really, really fast.
I did.
Section or THPO function 101B3D is essentially just saying how you will administer your funds. And most tribes, I just wanted to make this clear for anyone who may be applying or trying to figure out how to respond. Most tribes simply say something about the THPO office or the THPO individual or whatever will coordinate with your accounting department and or grants department to ensure that there's a drawdown of funds, submission of reports, and submission of annual budget requirements, including an audit reporting package. And that what I just said is literally what they say. That's it.
Yeah, it's boilerplate language.
You're just saying, I'm going to work with my accounting department and my grants department to make sure that we administer funds correctly.
There is one critical piece that's in this component that I forgot about, and I'm glad you brought this up, Everett. If you are the THPO and you are using THPO funding from NPS, you may not use that funding if you're going back to DC to do any kind of advocacy work. Remember that. Disconnect that part of your component of your budget so that if you are asked or required by your council to go back to DC to work on any kind of advocacy work, that you're utilizing tribal funds and not NPS provided funds, because that money is supposed to be spent on a reservation doing the preservation work, not advocacy seeking additional funding or other things that may be of interest to the tribe. So that's one piece to keep in mind, is that the NPS money can't be used to help the tribe send advocacy voices to DC.
Katie Valdez just hit the other nail on the head that I wanted to throw in. The only things, I said this earlier on, I really want to hammer this in because sometimes people don't get it for a while until they've like halfway through the application and then it suddenly clicks. These specific items that we're talking about are the only things that you can use your HPF funding from MPS for. These items. If it's not one of these items, you can't do it. And NAGPRA is a big one. People all the time will tell their tribe to go, their THPO to go do something, and they can do it. But then you have to, as any tribe knows, if you have an individual that works on multiple grants, they have to keep track of their hours that are expended under one grant. So if you have a THPO do NAGPRA work, they must not be paid out of their THPO grant during the duration of any time they spend on NAGPRA. A THPO is not the same thing as a NAGPRA person. And it's best practice to simply have another person to do it, or to have the THPO set up their job where they spend like 4 days a week doing THPO, 1 day a week doing NAGPRA, whatever like that, but you cannot mix them.
Yeah, I would advocate for that as well. Separation of those things is useful. Also on the fact that the amount of work that is required for both NAGPRA and for THPO work is pretty phenomenal. I mean, it's a great deal of research. It's a great deal of reading, and anybody can do it, but it's all time consuming. And so being aware that a NAGPRA is a full-time job and so is a THPO, and having somebody do both at the same time, even if you have available funding for it, you may not have a reasonable expectation of completion upon them. And you may need to rethink what you're trying to get out of the whole system.
And I just want to mention really fast that Everett brought up the HPF, and that's Historic Preservation Fund. When you become a THPO, or even you can Google it right now, it's a manual. The Historic Preservation Fund has a manual of the do's and don'ts of what THPO is to be doing to receive their money. And in there, it'll talk a little, I'm pretty sure it'll talk about NAGPRA. It'll talk about even how you use your money, how you're to spend that money, because we were going to try to start buying museum items, meaning cultural center items, meaning boxes, to, asset-free boxes. We can't use our funding to buy those type of things. So that HPF manual is really good. Historic Preservation Fund. I just wanted to say that.
Yeah, that's a wonderful point. And I'm sorry I didn't clear. I have a habit. I've been doing this for a while. I stay in my office and I just try to, as a good tribal employee, I keep my head down and my shoulders up, and then I start talking acronyms, and then people sometimes are like, what did you just say? The HPF manual describes what states may do with their funding. And I just wanted to clarify that it can be confusing, because when you read it, you're like, well, where do we come in? You're the state in that situation when you read it, because you've assumed the state's duty on your land. And so wherever it says the state can do this, the state can do this, they can't do this, just replace the word state with tribe on your land, and it'll all make sense. Otherwise, when you're reading it, it doesn't make any sense.
Okay, Eric, you were on a roll for the functions.
We did have a question come in on the side. I know. We had a question about NAGPRA and how that comes into protecting resources on trust lands. NAGPRA does have a criminal component to it. The one thing to remember is about trafficking. And if there's a NAGPRA civil or criminal complaint, you're probably going to be attached to it because the FBI or marshals are doing an investigation, not you. So your involvement with that is going to be at a different element. Now, if it's an ARPA violation, that's a different element, and there may be an additional NAGPRA component violation that could go on top of an ARPA violation, but that's a whole nother can of worms, and maybe not best for today's training, because we could end up spending several days just yarning about ARPA and how that works. So where did we leave off? We left off with D.
Hold on, before you move, David said, is if NAGPRA responsibilities are written into your ordinance, did you put a disclaimer that you'll seek additional funding? Best practice should be that the NAGPRA person should be funded. I just want to really quickly say, NAGPRA, you used to 10, 20 years ago, you used to be able to write a grant and get NAGPRA funding just to do NAGPRA. but that's not a thing anymore. You now, to get a NAGPRA grant, it has to be very project specific. You can't just get a generic NAGPRA grant anymore. You used to be able to do that 10 years ago. You cannot now. They only are specific to projects. Like, for example, your tribe will consult with XYZ museum about XYZ collection. And that's all you can get funding for anymore, period, whatsoever. They're very specific. You can't get, there is no longer funding to just pay for a NAGPRA person. That used to be a thing, and they've become too competitive now. And you cannot do that, unfortunately. I'm done, Eric.
I forget where we left off. Were we on D or E?
D, go to D.
You're on
D. Okay, administer the tribal program of federal assistance for historic preservation within tribal lands. Again, you know, in the case of my tribe, we wrote literally, the tribe manages several dozen federal grants and is fully capable of managing this federal assistance grants program. The tribe also has grant writers to assist with recurring grant applications and selective new competitive applications to enhance tribal programs. Once funding is obtained, each department administers its own funding and is responsible for its required reporting as well. The THPO will be responsible for the administration of this grant in conjunction with other applicable programs and employees. Super simple. We will report. We will make sure that we follow what the, you know, the compact and the agreement says and give you the required information. Again, some of this stuff sounds like it's far more convoluted than it really is. E, advise and assist. Again, this is something that you are probably already doing if you're already doing protection, cultural resource protection, right? Whether you're called a cultural resource protection program, an archive program, a museum program, a ceded lands program, whatever you want to call it. If you're working to protect those resources on and off reservation, you're already doing that function. You're already advising and assisting. So all you need to do is that you will continue to exercise that responsibility from the tribe and do the consultation, and we'll reach out and notify authorities that you've assumed that responsibility on the reservation. Super simple. Again, it can be a paragraph, maybe 2 if you need it tops. Next, we move down to F. Again, we're just screaming through these. So I know this is going to cause questions, folks. So please feel free to ask them as we're going along. Cooperate with the Secretary of Interior, the ACHP, to ensure that historic properties are taken into consideration at all levels of planning and development. Again, you are probably, and your community is probably already doing this and is probably trying to work very hard on how to exercise this off reservation. This is just codifying again that you're going to enter agreements where you need to. You'll enter MOUs, you'll enter MOAs, other forms of agreements as necessary in order to protect, identify, and preserve the resources of importance to the tribe on a reservation. And again, you'll have several examples, and these can be really short bulleted paragraphs. They don't need to be very long. When we move down to G, provide public information, education, and training and technical assistance in historic preservation. This is probably one of my favorite ones because it is so broad. You can do a community outreach to a local school, and that can be considered education. You can go to a local history group and give them a presentation about tribal history and identification and preservation of those locations, and that will work. You can give a presentation to tribal council on the actions that you've taken over the last year, and that counts. You can run an intern program and take tribal members that are trying to go to college and run them through your office as free labor and count that as your education and training opportunity. So there's lots of ways that you can use this, and you just got to be able to think about how are you going to utilize that in the best way to serve your community's needs. And again, right, Everett, please jump in.
I was waiting for you to reach the end of your thought. I'm sorry.
No, jump in. I never get the end.
Okay. I was just going to say, like, anything that's discussing historic preservation or regarding a specific site can be claimed. And so I went, like, even right now today, I will claim this on my grant, my time that because I'm spending time that I'm getting paid for to talk about historic preservation. So it's something I can put on my grant. But that's like, for example, in my tribe, the way we do things, every program director has to write a monthly report about what they did that gets submitted to our tribal leadership. And then once a quarter, every program director has to go and present in person at our tribal meetings about what they've been doing for the last quarter. And then once a year, when we have our annual council meeting, every program director has to write a report about what they did to the tribe for the last year. And all those things I claim. Just like, you're probably already doing all those things. If you have a program, you're already doing all those things. And anytime you get asked to talk, people show up to, maybe your tribe has a museum and people show up and they want to talk about a place, like, oh, somebody might come and ask you about a cemetery, and you start talking about how the tribe works to preserve that cemetery. That's something you can claim on there.
If the elders ask your office to come and give a presentation during an elders function, that qualifies. It can be super simple.
And I had talked about earlier how the part of the public education we do here at our THPO is taking the community out to the cultural sites. That's a cultural forum, as well as here in Reno, the city of Reno, for the whole month of July, every July is a cultural arts forum. We participate in that, just doing tours or showing a basket exhibit or doing a giant big collaborating with the Nevada Museum of Art and doing a big giant event for a whole day. And I also want to say that if you, any of the THPOs, any cultural resource person, if you are next to a university, it is really good to get into that archaeology department and anthropology department and get in there and present to those students. That's really important. So the universities are very important to that too.
You as the THPO, leveraging your relationships with the local universities, will develop the ethics that those archaeologists and anthropologists will be enacting in the field in the coming generations. So that can be a very daunting task to think about, but I think is highly important because they're the people that are going to be helping us manage or mismanage our resources in the very near future. And so you get to help guide them in knowing what is considered appropriate and not, if you reach out to those local universities. H is the one that I have seen most consistently passed up. As a matter of fact, don't know that I've seen a single application yet that has agreed to work with local governments and local historic preservation programs and looking to identify certified local governments. That is a function that usually gets reserved back to the SHPOs. Having said that, if your tribe is interested in assuming that responsibility, I would highly encourage you to reach out to some of the tribes that have extremely large THPO programs, like maybe Navajo, and seeing if they've assumed those responsibilities and how they're doing that and how that works. And then also work with your local SHPO and ask how they're doing that and what it looks like. Because if you're going to be implementing it, unfortunately, that's one of those few pieces where I don't have any experience to help provide a lot of guidance.
And in the application, if you're not going to assume this, because we don't, we just put the Reno Sparks Indian Colony will not assume this function at this time.
And then every year, whenever you do your grant report and your grant application, then it's still listed there, but it just says not assumed in our tribe's program plan.
Correct. And next we move down to I, consult with appropriate federal agencies in accordance with this act on. And so most of this work is going to result in consultation with the Bureau of Indian Affairs, NRCS, BLM, federal highways, and then your state departments of transportation, because usually they're getting federal highway funding, and that puts them as the lead on 106 and NEPA under some of the Transportation Act fundings. So you're going to have a lot of these you're already doing, but they're going to get worse, and you're going to see a volume increase as you get the THPO.
Well, that's what I was showing.
Yeah, the stacks are going to go bad. If I remember right, when we had a THPO at Grand Ronde, I went from 400 or 500 project reviews the first year before we had the THPO to like 8,000 the year after, and then it went to like 20,000 the year after that. And it just kept incrementally increasing. And it is a war of triage and attrition. And
Eric, I just want to say, this is where you're reviewing, responding, and monitoring projects that may impact our cultural resources, which they call historic properties or artifacts, our Native American. And this is where you're going to be working with these laws that we talked about, NHPA, NEPA, all of that. So,
and the big three words, right, are the determination of effect, right? That's where the crux hits the ground, is you as the THPO are going to make the determination of effect concurrence. If an agency like I at the BIA as the archaeologist, if I come to you with a proposed undertaking, I'm going to tell you what I think the project is going to do to any historic resources inside of the APE. So I'm going to make a determination of effect, and I'm going to ask your THPO, you, to concur with that finding of effect. If you agree and we have no potential to affect or no adverse effect, then the proposed action can come forward and we can do whatever mitigative or avoidance measures were identified in the consultation. If there's an adverse effect and I don't get your concurrence, then we go to ACHP and we go into big resolutions, and this is where the mitigation measures get identified. And this is, for me, working at BIA now and having been on the THPO side and now being on the agency side, I know where the holes are. And I know where agencies can sometimes take advantage and exploit these based on how we're determining on what a federal undertaking is, right? Because my undertaking as a contract, is that a administrative action, or is it the unintended consequences that come from the action of said contract? And this is where it's important for THPOs to understand that the definition of an undertaking is different under 106 than it is under NEPA. And the reason this is so critical is 106 is the legal authority for tribes to get a voice at the table. NEPA does not say tribes once in the CFRs. And HPA does repeatedly. It is the only spot where there's mandated consultation and tribes have that voice. And if you've assumed the responsibility of a THPO on a reservation, that concurrence gives you a great deal of authority in that interaction with the federal agency. And so that will extend off reservation, but your authority as a THPO at that point becomes symbolic, right? But the authority you carry will still be perceived by agencies. I see it happen all the time. They see the THPO status and they go, oh, they've got a THPO, so obviously they mean business. And they act with a certain level of deference, even if the tribe right next door has been doing it 20 years longer and doesn't have a THPO and is a cultural resource protection program. So it will give you a great deal of authority, take advantage of it, but also realize it's going to throw a lot of work at you. J, advise and assist in evaluation of proposals for rehab projects that may qualify for federal assistance. This one actually wasn't on the application when I did our application. So that's a new component that we didn't even address in our application. But I imagine and hope that one of the other examples that we're providing will address that. Everett, do you have any advice, comments, interest on that one?
That wasn't on there when we applied, and I'd never seen it in the application either. I didn't even know. When you started reading that, I became very bewildered.
All we did was we put the Reno Sparks Indian Colony will not assume this function at this time.
Jay.
Yeah, I really would hesitate caution on wanting to be involved with rehab work. Usually what that's going to entail, probably for most tribes, is taking over properties that have been improperly managed by Bureau of Indian Affairs or other federal agencies who've allowed a building or property to go derelict through mismanagement or no management. And then we'll want to rehab it in an attempt to turn title over to said tribe. And then we don't have to be responsible anymore for the preservation of said property. And if we could turn over title and then give you rehab money afterwards, then even better, because it's probably not going to be enough rehab money to accomplish the task in the first place. So be very mindful about rehab. Rehab is basically taking a historic site or resource that is almost losing its integrity and its eligibility and trying to reestablish it back to being ineligible. So usually you think about, okay, here's a good example. On the Grand Run Reservation, we have a fort that was actually utilized by General Phil Sheridan. It was one of his first military postings when he was a lieutenant. And there was a house he lived in, and the house was eventually owned and modified by people later after he left the fort and moved to a different location. Well, the Park Service, the Oregon Park Service, bought that house and then rehabbed it and actually paid somebody to use the exact same construction methods to re-put the house back the way it was so that they have that historic fort building, that dwelling for the officers' quarters. So rehab is kind of like taking something that is almost derelict and making it back to its historic function again. It's a pretty involved process and requires a lot of consultation with SHPOs, THPOs if you're the one doing it, and is often very complicated with all of the language of what is in-kind replacement and stuff. So that's a long one. Yeah.
All right, your application is done.
Is that okay? Wait, I have a question on that last one you were just talking about, Jay. So that would be the corresponding half of the tax credits, where the SHPO is able to enforce a tax credit, and then they use that for rehabilitation.
Yeah, so it probably is that. Yeah, but if the tribe's not posing taxes on the reservation, and how are you going to give tax relief for a historic property?
That's what I was going to ask. Where's the rehab money coming from? Because it's not coming from HPF funding.
It's probably, if I had to hazard a guess, it's probably like some of that HPF off funding where you have to competitively fight for it. And it's
Okay.
really weirdly written and stuff. Yeah, I would imagine it's not easily secured funding and not guaranteed.
Yes. Side note: there's a grant that another grant you can apply for. What is that called?
It's the Tribal Heritage Grants Program.
Which don't they only
And
award like 5 or 10 of it, and like 50 tribes apply every year?
they tell an opposite story. They encourage me to get, they implore me to encourage people to apply every year, because I think the year that I came on, 2019, either that year or the one before, they awarded 100% of the applications who applied. So I think it goes in cycles where a lot of people apply and very few people get one. And so then very few people apply and then everybody gets one.
We quit applying for it because everything we apply, well, then they always found a reason why they wouldn't fund it, because you can't do any new construction. You can only do rehab of an existing historic property.
So it's separate. It's a separate pot from the THPO apportionment grants. It's tribal heritage grants that are open to tribes without a THPO. And it's actually how the Park Service, it's my phrase, kind of checks that box of fulfilling their obligation to tribes without a THPO. I think not uncommonly, it's tribes with a THPO who have the wherewithal and capacity and know how to apply.
Pat Baird talking about these federal tax credits. I think that's a large part of J.
I think so too. Pat's the THPO for Nez Perce. So folks look in the box there and see what he's filling in for the rest. So he might have some more information for everyone.
Do those tax credits have to do with the climate adaptation stuff, or the
those are usually separate pots of funding. The climate adaptation stuff is usually separated out and administered by different agencies. A lot of this stuff is NPS grant funded stuff that's specific just for preservation and rehab work. And so the resiliency stuff is more often coming in through like EPA funding, NOAA, and NIMS, some of these other agencies. So it's not necessarily coming in. There has been discussion at least a few years ago when I was still at NPS about dealing with climate resiliency in some of their funding. But I don't know where that came and went because I haven't worked for the Park Service for a couple of years now.
Right now I'm working with the Mechoopda tribe, and they're trying to pass a bill that is working with Forest Service and different state agencies on creating a relationship and doing a contract to do land restoration and the climate adaptation on public lands and even on private
federal?
land. Federal, state, that's what we're going to be proposing. Allie and I are going to be going to Congress in June to testify on this program that she has in mind that has so many elements in it that it's not just a self-serving program. It's climate adaptation. It's workforce development. It's goods for service. There
are some examples of stuff like that going on. There's a group in California called CHIPS, the Calavera.
That's what she's doing.
Yeah, so the CHIPS program, I worked with them when I was at Yosemite National Park, and we got them to partner with a non-federally recognized tribe that we consulted with, and they brought the nonprofit in to hire tribal members to work doing ecological restoration within the park.
Yep.
And so because they were a nonprofit that primarily focused on ecological restoration, we could show a need. And the fact that they were hiring tribal members showed a different need, and it allowed it to go through. So those existing paths already exist for tribes to do. All they need to do is negotiate intergovernmental agreements with the agencies to provide services. And so those services just need to be negotiated. Is it ecological restoration? Is it cultural monitoring? Is it a combination of both of those? In some cases, you can use those kinds of compacts and agreements to get around existing federal legislation, like let's say National Park Service and their gathering rule, right? Tribes aren't allowed to gather inside of it without an official permit
unless we patent our cultural resources.
Correct. If you get a management contract with an intergovernmental agreement and agree to remove all of the slash and biomaterial outside of the park, all of a sudden you're getting harvest material for traditional foods and medicines as a byproduct of the cultural restoration activities.
Exactly.
And so you just try to find inventive ways to help make sure that the tribe's needs get met without breaking the convents that the government has to confine itself with. So.
And I invite any other tribal leaders that are on this call right now to email me or Allie, because we're trying to make sure that tribes are working together and not separately on this, because it's such an important issue.
So that was the functions one, which was number 6. And there's actually still a few more items in the application.
Well, right, we went through 7. It's a list of the THPO functions. It is still the same part. 6 and 7 are veritably the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
And 8 is just you providing a description of said activities. And in the case of some of the ones that we were going through, we read exact examples. What I would recommend is each of your communities are kind of looking at these applications tonight, these previously successful ones. Look at the sections for each one of these components and how they're written. Some of it is extremely boilerplate language that you can easily lift out and drop into your own application, but make sure to take a look because you're going to need to adapt it for the needs of your own community. Every community's got different needs and resources and qualifiers. So it's not a one box, not everything fits. So definitely take the time to look at all these, but all of it will be in those applications that you'll get. And most of it is super, super clear and easy language. Right, receive comprehensive tribal historic preservation plan again, administering the federal historic preservation within tribal lands again, right? You can note these same laws that they're noting here. And it may be useful to actually do that in the application. Again, you'll go through and see some of these in the applications again that you're gonna get. They'll break it down and give the citations. The CLG one is the one that we were talking about that most folks don't take on just because it's generally not useful for tribes to assume that responsibility. But again, each community is different. And if you have municipalities and local governments that are within your reservation boundaries, it may be a value for your tribe to exercise this responsibility within the reservation, especially areas like Oklahoma where the game is changing so dramatically now with the McGirt rule. So it may be something that is much more actively pursued by tribes here in the near future. We just don't quite know yet. Again, consulting, you're already doing this. And noting and sometimes having your policies and procedures that you've already developed and any tribal ordinances or policies and procedures that your council has developed or even mission statements will be useful in describing how you guys are going to go about this. I know for my tribe, we actually had a ceded lands ordinance where our tribe identified counties that were outside of our reservation, that the tribe clearly identified how we were connected to those via our treaties and that we wanted to consult on those and then authorized the THPO to consult on projects in that area. And so I could use that as legal authority for my tribe to go off the reservation to consult on behalf of the community's interests. And if they were like, well, how did you get over here? I'd be like, well, my tribe under this resolution said this county was in our area of interest, so sorry. Not every tribe wants to do that though. So don't think that your community needs to give a clean list of counties or a map. Your community needs to meet the needs that it has. So if you don't want a map or don't want a list of counties, don't do it.
I want to throw a comment in on that. Whenever every tribe will make an area of interest, and that's your land that you consult with. It's best practice to make an area of interest, I should say, county by county, of the land that you want to consult over that it's not part of your jurisdiction. And some tribes, you hit an important point. Some tribes make that, they get somebody like the THPO or a contractor or whatever to create a map, and then they approve it by resolution. Some tribes have the administrator or whatever the head of the tribal employees is approve it. Some tribes make it to the department director, i.e. the THPO's authority to approve changes to it. And my recommendation for best practices would be to not make it too incredibly complex of a process. Perhaps if your tribe feels like it's something that the elected leadership should be approving, then that's what they can do. But my reasoning for saying that is because the tribe may over time learn more information about an area, and you may learn that you had a gathering site that no one has talked about in over 100 years, but you might find a reference for it and you might want to add a county. And if it requires an act of 3 branches of government to make an amendment to your ancestral area of interest, that's going to create a problem for you later. That's why I say it's my recommendation that the THPO should be able to either themselves or maybe with their boss's approval make minor changes, but you also want to have some level of approval, because if somebody gets into the role that you maybe later down the road isn't going to be the best THPO, you don't want them to create drastic changes to the program without any kind of oversight.
Correct. And I just put some language from 36 CFR 800 into the text box. It's the second time I've entered it in. This is important, especially for those of you who are going to want to consult on properties that are off your reservation. If a federal agency is indicating that they want you to explain why you want to consult under 106, they don't get to make that determination. The Act and the CFRs and the guidance on how to implement the Act clearly say the agency official to consult with any Indian tribe or Native Hawaiian organization that attaches religious or cultural significant properties to the affected undertaking, regardless of the location of the historic property. So if your tribe has identified a property that is outside of the reservation boundaries, this citation is what you need in your literature back in response to the agency saying why you have an interest in it and why you should be justified in part of the consultation process.
Most agencies won't push you on it now because they, tribes don't actually have, I mean, because theoretically a tribe could say, we're not allowed to discuss why this area is sacred to us. I mean, many tribes do, at which point then they just have to say, well, okay. Most agencies won't push that. But if they do, you also have to bear in mind too, though, that they are required to make a good faith effort. And similarly, so are you. You should be putting forth a good faith effort, and you should try to work with them where you're able. But again, that boils down to where your THPO, as Eric was describing, kind of has to walk in between and figure out how to communicate with agencies and communicate with the tribe. And sometimes there may be stuff that they can't talk about, or maybe the THPO knows about, but they can't discuss it with the agency or whatever.
I used to tell people all the time when I was the THPO, I'm here to talk about things that I'm not supposed to talk about with people that aren't even supposed to know about it in order to protect it on behalf of my community. And it sounds like a bit of nonsense. And I know all of you are I see some folks chuckling and stuff because it's the same song and dance I'm sure everybody's had to say at some point or another. But it's something that we have to repeat all the time. I mean, some of our communities have secret societies where, things are structured based on age and whether you're part of a certain society or clan group, or, even your gender, on whether you're going to get access to information that is culturally important. And having the ability to share that publicly in a way that is going to preserve things is a difficult thing for you to have to deal with. And it's also hard, I think, for the general public sometimes to realize that our communities, our Bibles were written in books. They were written in the landscape. And in order to read them, we have to go to those places and see them and dance and sing at those places for them to remind us of those stories and how we came here. And so every time one of those places disappears, it's another chapter, another book of the Bible disappeared out of our ability to maintain that cultural integrity to the next generation. And so it's vitally important that we identify these places, protect them, preserve them, and ensure that our community can maintain the knowledge about them so that they never disappear, because they are literally the thing that made us who we are.
Okay. Wow. Thanks, you guys. I think we made it through that flyover of the application. And I confess that I am sitting here getting an email together to send you the Grand Ronde one that Eric keeps referencing, as well as the Pasquat Yaqui one from 2019 that I believe the Park Service also makes available. And it is 4:20 here, so I'm going to leave the Zoom line open and invite everyone to stay if you want. And if you have to hop off, then this concludes our official programming for today. And thank you so much for joining us, everybody, especially to our expert panel of trainers. We are so grateful that you guys are taking the time to share your knowledge and experience with us. It's so interesting to see what all the options are and what the range of experiences are with all of these different things. It's been super informative for me, and I can see by the chat box that I hope it has been for our participants as well. So with that, I'm going to stop talking and get this email out to you guys. And if you have to hop off, then we will see you at the same time tomorrow, hopefully, hoping you're able to join us then at 1 Eastern, where if you have the agenda that I emailed to you on day 1, we will do a brief recap of today and see what outstanding questions folks may have briefly. And then we will jump into a more detailed approach to the application, walk through the Grand Rond one together in a guided panel format, and see where gaps are at the end, what other questions folks may have after another few hours of discussion tomorrow. And then what you should be keeping in mind all along is this sort of checklist, the actual checklist. But one thing that I've got in my own notes here is homework questions that need to be answered to enable efficient and effective completion of the application process. So do you feel ready to move ahead and get that one-on-one sort of wizard experience with the May and a June workshop, which are going to be generously sponsored by BIA. So those will also be offered free to participants, although as Michonne said at the beginning, last March, they had 6 tribes and 1 consultant per tribe for that workshop. And we have maxed out at about 73 participants here today. So we may need to strategize how we're going to break that down into 2 workshops. I'm really delighted at this participation, but translating it to a virtual format for the first time and having this delightfully overwhelming number of participants may create an interesting challenge for us. So at the end of tomorrow, we will talk about maybe breaking folks who are interested in making that commitment to getting the application done, how we would break that out into 2 groups, or what other discussions we may need to have about that next round of workshops if you feel like you're ready to actually move ahead with these things for your tribe.
If I can make a last suggestion for tomorrow, it's just going to be 3 hours. Of course, the application, creating and writing the application is going to be longer, but maybe for a suggestion for tomorrow is have some, because I'm on the laptop at my office, and then I have the older laptop over here up to the left of me. And I'm just wondering if you guys could copy and paste or even write it, because I see people writing the application questions. And while we're going through the boilerplate tomorrow with Eric and his application, you guys can begin typing and writing in the questions kind of related to your area. It's just a suggestion, because at one point in our time tomorrow is this will just be 3 hours, like I said, but one point later on down the road when you're writing them, and hopefully, throughout before May and June, that you're getting an idea of how to put your tribe's information into that application. I hope that made sense. So you guys can just get an old computer and start typing in the questions. I think that's kind of what we did. So hopefully that'll be helpful, because tomorrow will be good. Thank you.
See a raised hand from Helen Alton. You can unmute yourself, I think. There you go.
I just wondered, is there a chance that we could do a one-on-one with Eric or Everett? Because we do have some questions about whether we are even eligible given the land status.
I mean, I could give you my opinion, but MPS would be the actual authority on defining that. If it's a complicated question, and I don't know your specific, I'm not even sure what nation you're from, but if it's like from a different state, like I'm fairly familiar with Oklahoma, but if you're not from Oklahoma, I'm probably not going to be very familiar with your land status.
Well, it's Alaska, and Alaska's got, a bunch of tribes have ANCSA land, but our tribe doesn't. And we have land, but it's not BIA trust, it's not a reservation. And there's only 1 THPO in Alaska. And the SHPO in Alaska was having a hard time coming up with an idea for us as well. So I just wondered what, nobody in Alaska seems to be doing the THPO. So
It's
is there a
because of the
reason?
lack of reservation status. The
Right.
Alaska Native Settlement Claim Act kind of got rid of the concept of reservations. And because of that lack of trust lands, that's where the THPOs can assume jurisdiction. And so it creates kind of a conundrum where now you have tribes that have a land base that doesn't meet the legal definition of a reservation for them to manage the resources. And so it's not a fair breakdown for what Alaska Natives have gotten. I think there's only 2 or 3 communities that are up there that are even eligible to get THPOs because of this. Metlakatla being one of them, because they actually have a reservation, so much so that they actually asked to be separated away from Alaska BIA to be managed by the Northwest region, because their reservation situation is so vastly different than the rest of Alaska. So it's what I would recommend if you want to do that is, Val, can you make sure that my email goes out to everybody, and then give me an email, and I will reach out to the archaeologist at the BIA up there, and maybe we can start a conversation and try to see if we can get like some kind of a status report on lands, and then we can start an informal conversation that you can use that information to take to NPS to get that information on whether or not you're eligible. Because I think you're asking for a technical question that's going to be a little, but it's going to take a bureaucrat paid higher than I am.
Okay, well, thank you. I mean, I just wondered what was happening in Alaska, because we have so many tribes and none of them have the THPO. Cake is the only one that did the THPO, and
Yeah.
That's right.
Metlakatla has been talking to me about trying to potentially look at doing one as well.
And
Okay.
then on January 19th, the day before the inauguration, there was a solicitor's opinion from the Department of the Interior, I think reaffirming that unfortunate situation. So I am also not the person to answer that question, but Eric, I will put your email into the chat box there.
I probably
Great.
won't be able to do anything with this information, but is there a way you could, like you said you have land, is it held in some sort of fiduciary status? Like is it in trust at all in some way or level, or is it just privately owned by the tribe, or?
It's privately owned by the tribe. Land has been is being donated back to the tribe.
So you were stripped of your land by that act, and now you have reacquired it
But
via
it's in fee
buying
status,
it.
so it's under state jurisdiction. Yeah, I mean, it almost seems like you guys need to apply or work with legislation to create a category of trust land for Alaska Natives, because when they created the Alaska Native Settlement Claim, they kind of goofed up that whole process. Well, I shouldn't say kind of, they totally messed it up. Yeah, there we go. There's my email. Email me. Let's reach out to the archaeologist. Maybe we can get the realty program. Maybe we can get an answer on legal status and then use that to go to NPS to get an answer. I don't know where that's going to go, Helen, but we can at least confuse the other bureaucrats.
Okay, well, thank you. Thank you.
I apologize. I'm going to jump off. I've got another meeting with other agencies I've got to go jump onto. But if anybody has questions, I'll be on tomorrow, and you can always feel free to email me. And my phone number will eventually go out to everybody as well if you need it.
Thank you, Eric. We appreciate you.
Thank you,
See you
everyone. Bye-bye.
Okay, well, others are still here. Questions, comments? Plans for dinner? Should we head to the bar?
It's Tuesday. I suggest tacos.
My daughter just came home from school, and apparently we have to go to the neighborhood snow cone stand to meet her new friend. They're in hybrid school, so it's kind of a treat that she'll get to see this other little girl without a mask on. So that'll be fun.
I'm gonna head out too, so picture me rolling.
Thank you, Michonne. We have a raised hand through here from Lydia. You can unmute yourself, I believe.
Here.
There we go.
Thank you.
Mhm.
My name is Lydia Paporkas, and I'm from a tribe, unfederally recognized tribe in California. It's Kakuntaruk, Band of the Ohlone Costanoan Indians of the Big Sur. And this has been very, very helpful for me. I have been doing monitoring for the state parks here in California in our Aboriginal footprint, and also with other agencies in the Monterey area. And my question is because we're not federally recognized, then I guess we wouldn't be eligible for this THPO, but then it seems like in a way I am, as the young lady said from Reno, was it, I don't remember her name, Michonne?
Michonne.
Said if we're doing all those things, we are like THPOs. So would I still be able to join in tomorrow's meeting workshop? Would that be okay for me to still be able to join in tomorrow for your workshop?
Oh, definitely. Yeah, for sure.
Okay, I just wanted to know that, because I know that at this time, our tribe wouldn't be eligible for this to be able to put in an application. But this information is very good for us to know now, because it's kind of my starting for learning all this that down the road, hopefully, should we become federally recognized, that we can use all these wonderful resources that are available to us. And
Yes, please. That was the intent of this one. Moving forward into the workshops we have not yet scheduled, hopefully to be held in May and June. Folks would want to make sure that they meet the eligibility criteria, because we're planning to assign a consultant per tribe to actually go through the application. But this one today and tomorrow is informational.
thank you so much. I really appreciate all the sharing and the wonderful information that was shared with all of us today.
It's our pleasure. We're glad you could join us.
Thank you again.
Briefly. Lydia,
Yes.
was your tribe terminated, and you're seeking to regain federal recognition?
Well, I don't know if it would be terminated, because yet on the state capitol on the west side of the steps, they put a seal down, and it does say the Ohlone. It actually lists us twice there as Ohlone and Costanoan. I want to say we're not a terminated tribe, because state parks and agencies are listening to not only our tribe, but our neighboring sister tribes. And right now we're trying to kind of come together, something that we haven't done, to maybe become a stronger voice. So that's why I'm here today.
I think I just want to mention there are some tribes that do not have trust land, or maybe have complicated federal recognition status, that have created a THPO program, and it's not funded or recognized by NPS as being official, but they can still act as a consulting party in certain circumstances. And so you may be able to still consult with the government in certain circumstances. But I think that's something that we should perhaps have a conversation with tribes that were in that circumstance, or may still be. There are a few tribes that do not have there are some tribes that have trust land that never got a THPO program through NPS, for example. And our board maybe will talk about that later and see if maybe we can discuss options for tribes that don't meet the requirements to have a THPO program, but how they can still be involved in consultation. But I don't have all the answers to that. My tribe's not in that situation, but there are others that are in a similar situation to you.
Thank you. I do consult with state parks and regional parks as well. And now we also are, because we're on the Native American Heritage Commission list. So it's therefore the parks, when they want to do development or proposed projects, they have to notify the tribes as to if we have concerns on this project, which most of them we do, because our people were all over that land in the area. So that I am grateful for, but it's, as you were saying, reading, I have to read like all the things for like AB 52, SB 18, and so much more is coming at me. It's a lot to take in for me. So we are blessed with that at least we can consult with state parks on some of the projects. Again, thank you so much, and I'll just have a wonderful rest of the day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And I see that Anthony has a hand raised. Unmute yourself.
Hi.
Hi.
So I'm a member of Island Band of Miwok Indians. We just got trust land this last year. Probably recognized for quite a while now, but it took a while to get land interest. Anyways, so we'll be doing this all for the first time. My question is basically, if we mess something up in this application, is NPS gonna be like, too bad, you're done, try again next year? Or will there be opportunities to work with them to correct those issues so we can have that status by next year's round of funding? That's pretty much our question.
Yeah, no, they're happy to work with you guys to have some back and forth to get in a satisfactory application. It's not like a pass or fail sort of test situation. And I will also say that the main reason they don't have someone here representing them during this workshop is the position is sort of transitional. They've just advertised the THPO program manager as a 1-year detailee. They're looking, I think, for someone internally to fill the position. Right now it's Karen Wild who's doing those duties in addition to her regular duties, I believe, as a regional tribal liaison. We're hoping to have them participate with us in May and June, but Karen is very responsive. She's happy to answer any questions. They would love to have a dialogue with you guys about your application. We at NAPO, we're a nonprofit. We're trying to do as much as we can to help you through this process. Ultimately, it remains a Park Service process, but they're not sitting there in their ivory tower waiting to nitpick any little thing and throw your application out. They want more of you guys to succeed at this too. It's just I've been on the government side of things too, not in Park Service, and I know what that's like. And so it's a real blessing and an opportunity to be in the nonprofit world now, where I think we're a little more free and open to do things that need to be done.
I guess seeking further clarification, does that back and forth have to happen before that July 31st deadline though? I mean, if something gets caught after the deadline, are they gonna have back and forth with us?
So THPO applications, yeah, no, they accept applications year round. So what the deadline
okay,
is,
I saw July 31st deadline.
No, to clarify what that deadline is to be eligible to then apply for the grant apportionment in the current year's funding cycle. And you actually need to have the agreement in place with DOI, with Interior. So like, Everett, correct me, but signed by tribal leadership. Like, here's the MOA, it's done.
I'll look at ours. I think it has to be signed by leadership and by NPS.
Yeah. And so that's what needs to be done by July 31st in order to be able to apply for the current year's THPO funding. And so if you're not able to get that final agreement in place by July 31st, then just keep working. And whenever you get it done, it's done. Congratulations. Welcome to the family of THPOs. But you would need to wait for the next year's funding cycle in order to be able to apply for that apportionment grant.
So do you have like a recommendation of like, shoot for this date to have everything written so you have time to get those signatures and agreements in place? Like, is that usually a couple months long process? Or?
It is a couple months long process. We, in talking about scheduling May and June workshops, I will confess that we sort of realized after the fact. I have not personally walked someone through this process before, but yeah, so advisory council has to sign off, your SHPO has to sign off and agree that your tribe is capable, which everyone realizes is a totally colonialist and paternalistic and inappropriate word, but that's the word in, in the regs of assuming the duties of a THPO. So it can all be a several months long process. We're going to go ahead and stick to our timeline now to see how many we can get done, because we've been hearing here and there that there are tribes out there that are in the process of doing their application. So if you're able to get the agreement done by then, great. And if not, then we will all keep working together to help you get it done whenever you get it done, and you'll be eligible for funding the next year.
So to clarify, whenever you do your agreement between the Park Service and your tribal nation, it looks kind of like a resolution where there's a series of whereas clauses, and then it stipulates itemized issues that you agree to, or items that you agree to. I don't know if they call that a clause or whatever, but the last one, it's the agreement shall become effective upon signature by the director of the National Park Service or his designee, which signature shall not incur until after the tribal leader, or it says the name of our tribal leader, has signed this agreement. So our tribal leader signed our agreement in December of 09, and it wasn't until the very end of January of 10, so a month and a half later, that Park Service signed it. But that's when it becomes effective, is once the head of MPS has signed a document. Now, I don't know the funding window. I think you have to have your thing in before that funding window, and then theoretically, I think Park Service could sign it afterward. But then I think it's reliant upon their signature. Is that right, Valerie?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So give them a couple months to sign it.
I would. It'd probably be best if you could do that. Yeah.
I'm not sure that the signing process on their end necessarily takes that long. There's just there's a lot of steps with a lot of different parties.
That's part of the, yeah. Because then they want to communicate with you back and forth, and I think that's where you also have to have the resolutions in place. They want to make sure that you have the resolutions in place, designating someone as a THPO, and can't remember what else they check for. It's been so long.
Thank you.
There was a question in the chat box, Val.
Yeah, David, the fiscal year does start on October 1st. The actual consideration of apportionment grants by the Park Service is kind of its own timeline. So the federal fiscal year starts on October 1st, but very, very rarely does the federal government have a budget passed by Congress by that time. It's usually several months behind getting the budget passed. So then when Congress finally passes the full federal budget, that includes those numbers for THPOs and the HPF. And then the Park Service has to go and do their formulation that's based on a flat amount, and then added onto that land area. I'm gonna say it's like 19 and 81%, or 81 and 19%. And then they put out the call for THPOs to submit their grant application for that money, which is actually open right now and closes in a couple of weeks. So it's not necessarily the beginning of the federal fiscal year that all of that happens. It tends to be quite a bit behind, but on the Park Service and administratively, they have a requirement that that agreement is in place July 31st in order to be, which would have been last year, in order to be eligible to apply for the apportionment grant that's currently open.
It's strange because we report on a normal calendar year, but we apply and receive funding for a federal fiscal year, which is strange, but our reporting is done on a calendar year. Like you have to have when you do your, I don't know if that makes, Valerie is squinting like that, it makes sense. So at the end of the year,
it does make sense. It's just crazy.
so when you get a THPO program, say you get your THPO program in effect, then you're going to apply for your funding, and then you'll receive it based on a fiscal year. And so the October 1, and then you have that year to expend your funding. But when you do your report to tell the government what you use that funding for, it'll be due at the end of the calendar year, December 31st, which is really strange. Most federal grants don't work that way. I don't know why it's that way, but that's how it is.
Okay. That was a really good question, Anthony. Not sure if we answered it or further confused lots
I
of
probably just
issues.
stirred the mud up even more.
Any other questions?
My takeaway is to have this all ready to go at the end of this month if we want to try to be in there. Start conversations at the end of the month with an application to present. That's what I'm thinking now if we want to try to get.
Yeah, I think that they would probably say that. Like I said, what we're gonna do is see how many folks we can get further along, in the interest of getting more folks further along. And then if funding needs to wait until next year, then unfortunately that's Park Service thing. More questions, comments, knock jokes?
All my knock jokes are not appropriate for public.
All righty. Well, I'm not seeing any more hands raised.
I will say there was a lot of people on here, and I'm not going to be on the call tomorrow. So for everyone who joined, I just want to say thank you. I was really impressed with the turnout that this had. So thank you all, and I'm glad to see you all. And I hope you got something good out of us rambling on about federal regulations and everything else. And I just want to tell you all that I appreciate it, and I hope that whoever doesn't have a THPO program here and that's trying to, I hope you get your application in soon, and we look forward to you joining the ranks of Tribal Historic Preservation Officers. And I hope that you all join THPO, because not only do they do interesting little trainings like this, but we have a nice annual conference. And I'm just putting in a shameless plug. We need all the THPOs we can get. So thank you.
Thank you, Everett. We appreciate you. Thanks for your time today and sharing your knowledge and expertise. And thanks for the plug for THPO. We do our best, and it's very true. The more, the merrier. What you see here is what our capacity is, and it's the most that it's ever been. So yay, team. We rely on our board for growth and for that knowledge base. It's, the beauty of it is what you see here, this community and family of THPOs. I certainly don't have all the answers, but if I can bring people to the table and point people in the right direction, then that's what we're all about. So thanks for that, Everett. We appreciate you. All righty. Seems like people are ready to move on to the next thing here, and I need to as well if we don't have any more questions or comments. And hopefully we will see most of you back here tomorrow afternoon, and I will get that email out to you. I'm fighting with my export list right now. Thanks everyone for joining us. Have a great evening.